In my previous video, I explained at length how Edgar Allan Poe stole the Raven from Matthew Franklin Whittier, which is to say myself, in the 19th century. I think 24 people have seen it since then, have looked at some portion of the video. The stats tell me that not everybody watches the whole video. You know, if you average it out between the people that watch 3 seconds and the people that watch the whole thing, it shows like 6 minutes, something like that. So I try not to get depressed by that. But 24 people in the entire world have seen fit to see a detailed explanation of the fact that Edgar Allan Poe was not the author of The Raven. So, I don't think I have to tell you to share these things. If you feel so inclined, I would suggest that you share them because we need to get the word out. But I found another piece of evidence recently. It was actually something I had. I just didn't realize how strong it was. And this has to do with Margaret Fuller's false claim to Matthew's work in the New York Tribune, where he was signing as a star or a single asterisk. This is something he'd done off and on since 1829. It's the earliest example I have. And then the latest example I have is 1873. So he kept right on in different newspapers signing with a star, which had a deep significance to him, I believe. And Margaret Fuller just falsely claimed this body of work because she was the literary editor at the time. And the rumor got around that she must have been the author, and then apparently she acquiesced falsely and said, oh yes, that was me. And then when she went to Europe as the paper's foreign correspondent, she continued to sign with that pseudonym, but it was not hers, it was Matthew's. Matthew continued right on in other papers to use it. So the reason that's significant as regards The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe is, first of all, it puts Matthew in New York City at the time that The Raven was published there. And secondly, one of the strongest clues that Matthew left embedded in one of his pieces was signing as the star in the New York Tribune. So if that review, which is the review of The Raven and Other Poems, Poe's compilation, if that review is taken to have been written by Margaret Fuller, nobody's looking for any embedded clues in it. But the minute you understand that that was actually written by Matthew Franklin Whittier, you start scrutinizing it and saying, well, did he drop a hint? Well, he dropped a whopper of a hint, and that's in my paper concerning The Raven, and I'll put that link down below here. But I want to establish that Matthew was, in fact, writing as the star for the Tribune, and it was he who dropped that magnificent, monstrous clue. And the clue says that Poe stole the Raven from him and that Poe was a phony, an idiot. Okay, there's no question about it once you know what you're looking for. Well, I'm not going to go into that. I just want to go into this smoking gun that I found, that Matthew was, in fact, the star-writing author in the New York Tribune. And for this, you have to be able to discern real spirituality from false. You have to be able to discern a person who really believes in and strongly advocates for the reality of paranormal phenomena versus somebody who is, it's hard to say what Margaret Fuller really believed, but she put on a show of open-mindedness, a show of liberality, a show of spirituality, and gave the impression that she was open-minded as opposed to closed-minded skeptics. But she wasn't an advocate. She didn't really have conviction. What she had conviction of was that hypnosis works. Well, we all know today, even in the most materialistic portions of society, that hypnosis works. Okay, so she used it. Apparently she derived some benefit from it, and she believed in magnetism or mesmerism or hypnosis. But as for the other phenomena which were associated with it, that really were not hypnotic phenomena, they were paranormal phenomena that at that time was kind of explained within the envelope of magnetism, see? But we're talking things like levitation and spirit visitations and things like that. Well, she stopped short of advocating for those things. She kind of poetically said that she was open-minded and that she was spiritual and that she was subject to spiritual influences all her life. And vague things like that, but she stopped short of being an advocate. I don't mean to be too redundant with that, but what we'll find is that Matthew Franklin Whittier was a very strong advocate who was thoroughly convinced. And when I say thoroughly convinced, I mean at this time in the mid 1840s. If you go back to 1825 through about 1830, you'll find that Matthew was a skeptic. And very, very slowly, his future wife and his current mentor, Abby Poyen, was trying to convince him, because she had studied these things since a little kid, since probably younger than 14. As of 14, she was writing about these things, but probably she had learned them at her mother's knee, literally, as a little girl. And we have a poem by her talking about her as a little girl out in the countryside looking for the fairies that her mother had told her about. So I can absolutely confirm this. Well, she had taught him about the paranormal, and he had resisted. He'd actually made fun of it back in like 1829 or so. And then gradually he came around. Well, by the time we get to the mid-40s, which is a few years after Abby's death in 1841, he's becoming a very strong advocate. He had been a Swedenborgian, a follower of Emanuel Swedenborg. He later became a spiritualist, which we'll see proof of and evidence for. And he was writing in no uncertain terms about this. So it so happens that there is in the weekly, I have it in the Weekly Tribune. In the Daily Tribune, it's in the July 23, 1845 edition. There's a star-signed review called The Seeress of Prevorst. I don't know how that's pronounced, Prevorst. It's a book by Dr. Justinus Kerner, and it's translated by Catherine Crowe, and we'll find out who Catherine Crowe is in a little bit. But that review is a positive review. It's a review of someone who is thoroughly convinced and wants to convince others. It's not a review of somebody who is sitting on the fence, see, and being equivocal about it, which is what Margaret Fuller was. So this is not Margaret Fuller writing this review for the New York Tribune. And what we're going to do is look at her Summer on the Lakes. Now, let's see. I have to go get something. I'll be right back. This book is called Margaret Fuller, Critic, and it is by Judith Matson Bean and Joel Meyerson. They're the editors. And what they've done is to take these star-signed reviews in the 1844-1846 New York Tribune and compile them. And then they've got a long introduction. Apparently, this is Judith Matson Bean's book, and she pulled in Joel Meyerson, who was a more established academic, kind of for credentials. That's what I gather. I don't think he really wrote it. I think his name is on it. So what they've done is they put what they felt were the most important ones in text. And then in the back, they have a CD. And the CD in PDF format has all of them. Well, the one that I'm going to share with you didn't make it to the print book. Apparently, they didn't feel like it was important enough, or they were embarrassed by it because it was too strongly in favor of the paranormal, and it didn't fit with Margaret Fuller, which it doesn't. But they did include it in the CD, and I have it in the weekly edition, the physical copy here. So we're going back to original sources with this. There's no question that that was one of the reviews, even though it doesn't show up in the print version of this book. They mention in the CD, in a footnote, that Margaret Fuller had written extensively about this same book in its original German, The Seeress of Prevorst by Dr. Kerner. And so they assume, they don't say it, but they clearly infer that because she had written extensively on this, obviously she had written the star-signed review. They're just assuming it. Well, that's a huge mistake, because she wrote about it all right, but she didn't write about it in anywhere near the same tone as Matthew wrote about it in the Tribune. We're going to compare these things. It's going to take us a little while to do it. I'm going to go ahead and let my Kindle start up here. Unfortunately, it was kind of low on charge, so I charged it all morning, and I think we're up to 39%. So hopefully 39% will do us. I'm going to go through my notes here while we let this thing start. Catherine Crowe was a paranormal writer in England, a British paranormal writer. In 1848, she wrote something called The Night Side of Nature. And this is a hard-hitting book of paranormal investigation. It provides some very strong evidence, just exactly like what you'd see today by people who are trying to establish the reality of near-death experiences or reincarnation or anything else along that line. She was a serious researcher. She dealt in facts, she dealt in evidence, and that's the same person who wrote this book, this translation of Dr. Kerner's German book. See, so that's who we're dealing with. We're not dealing with somebody who's kind of a skeptical, semi-skeptical philosopher or somebody like Margaret Fuller was. So this is a whole different bird here than Margaret Fuller. So now we're up. I will go into The Night Side of Nature a little bit later. What I'm doing right now is to just compare three things for those of you that don't like to watch the whole video. So we're going to look at Summer on the Lakes in 1843, which was published by Margaret Fuller in 1844 about a trip that she took. We're going to look at an article that was submitted to the Portland Transcript for the September 23, 1855 edition, which I think Matthew wrote. It's unsigned, but it has his signature underneath a description of physical mediumship. This committee, and Matthew was an officer in the association, Spiritual Association in Portland, Maine. This committee decided to scientifically investigate physical mediumship and went to several seances. They testified as to the phenomena that they personally saw, and this committee signed, each one of them signed underneath, and Matthew's signature, M.F. Whittier, is among those signers. I'm going to share that with you. And then we're going to look at the Weekly Tribune article, the star-signed article, which I'm quite certain Matthew was the author of. And we're going to see whose attitude is reflected in that star-signed article. Is it the kind of wishy-washy Margaret Fuller, whom I'll read to you here, or is it the absolute diehard, convinced paranormal investigator, Matthew Franklin Whittier? It's obvious which one it is, but you have to have some idea what you're looking at. Now, I should say that I have been studying the paranormal and higher mysticism for almost 50 years now. So I'm an expert on this topic, and most academicians, especially materialistic ones, people who are convinced by the point of view of philosophical materialism, they are not experts on this subject, okay? So I have it over them, okay? I'm the expert and they are not on this subject. Now, let's see. I'm going to pull this up here. And what we're going to look at is Margaret Fuller in Summer on the Lakes. And I'm going to start on page 125. And I just want, she's very tricky. She's very, very smart, and she's very, very clever. And she apparently was raised by her father, Pygmalion-like, to be a spiritual genius, a female spiritual genius, you know, like My Fair Lady, in other words. And she's very good at it, but she's faking it, okay? And what I want is for you to listen to what she's actually saying, okay, underneath. She says, returning, this is going to take a little while because I want, you know, this is evidence and I want to give her a chance, okay? Returning to Milwaukee, much fatigued, I entertained myself for a day or two with reading. The book I had brought with me was in strong contrast with the life around me. Very strange was this vision of an exalted and sensitive existence, which seemed to invade the next sphere in contrast with the spontaneous, instinctive life, so healthy and so near the ground I had been surveying. This was the German book entitled, and she gives the full German title. Both she and Matthew could translate German. The Seerest of Prevorst, Revelations Concerning the Inward Life of Man and the Projection of a World of Spirits into Ours, communicated by Justinus Kerner. This book, published in Germany some 12 years since, and which called forth there plenteous dews of admiration, as plenteous hailstorms of jeers and scorns, I never saw mentioned till some year or two since in any English publication. Then a playful but not sarcastic account of it in the Dublin magazine so far excited my curiosity that I procured the book intending to read it so soon as I should have some leisure days, such as this journey has afforded. Then she speaks of Dr. Kerner. Dr. Kerner, its author, is a man of distinction in his native land, both as a physician and a thinker, though always on the side of reverence, marvel, and mysticism. He was known to me only through 2 or 3 little poems of his in Catholic legends, which I much admired for the fine sense they showed of the beauty of symbols. In other words, he writes really nicely, whether she believes in anything he says or not. Here, so you've got to read between the lines. Here he gives a biography, mental and physical, of one of the most remarkable cases of high nervous excitement. Notice how she characterizes it. She's not talking about phenomena. She's talking about high nervous excitement, which she's quite familiar with, being neurotic. That the age, so interested in such, yet affords, with all its phenomena of clairvoyance and susceptibility of magnetic influences. I insert some account of this biography at the request of many who have been interested by slight references to it. The book, a thick and heavy volume, written with true German patience, some would say clumsiness, has not probably and may not be translated into other languages. Well, it was. Actually, Catherine Crowe, the paranormal investigator, was translating it probably as she spoke. As to my own mental position on these subjects, it may be briefly expressed by a dialogue between several persons who honor me with a portion of friendly confidence and of criticism, and myself expressed as, italic, free hope, that's her. The others may be styled old church, good sense, and self-poise. Now this idea, if I'm not mistaken, this idea of a dialogue, kind of an imaginary dialogue, is something that Matthew created in the Dial. When she was the editor, he was writing and signing as F. That was not F for Fuller, it was F for Franklin. And when Matthew had lost Abby very recently, the only way he could get himself to write, this is what I feel, was to imagine Abby still with him and helping him write and discussing these things, debating these things with him as he wrote, the way that he would have when she was alive. And so he was the one that started these dialogues in the Dial, and then she imitated one, and it's a horrible imitation, the one that she did. And now she's picked up this again as though it's her style. That's what I think, but I can't prove that now. Anyway, she splits herself up and she becomes free hope. Now let's see, this is good sense. Presumably that's the skeptic. I wonder you can take any interest in such observations or experiments. Don't you see how almost impossible it is to make them with any exactness, how entirely impossible to know anything about them unless made by yourself, when the least leaven of credulity, excited fancy, to say nothing of willing or careless imposture, spoils the whole loaf. Beside, allowing the possibility of some clear glimpses into a higher state of being, what do we want of it now? All around us lies what we neither understand nor use. Our capacities, our instincts for this, our present sphere, are but half developed. Let us confine ourselves to that till the lesson be learned. Let us be completely natural before we trouble ourselves with the supernatural. I never see any of these things, but I long to get away and lie under a green tree and let the wind blow on me. There is marvel and charm enough in that for me. And Margaret Fuller, as Free Hope, answers, and for me also. Nothing is truer than the Wordsworthian creed on which Carlyle lays such stress, that we need only look on the miracle of every day to sate ourselves with thought and admiration every day. But how are our faculties sharpened to do it? Precisely by apprehending the infinite results of every day. It all sounds good. There's no real substance to this, but she really knows how to sound spiritual. Who sees the meaning of the flower uprooted in the plowed field? Now she's going to give away, her real attitude. The plowman who does not look beyond its boundaries and does not raise his eyes from the ground? No, but the poet who sees that field in its relations with the universe and looks oftener to the sky than on the ground. Well, get this. Only the dreamer shall understand realities, though, in truth, his dreaming must not be out of proportion to his waking. So she really believes that this is fantasy, that this is dreaming, see? But she wants to sound spiritual. So this is not a paranormal investigator, okay? Anybody should be able to see this. So let's move on a little bit to page 131 and 133. I don't want to leave her with the idea, the impression that I have been unfair to her. Okay, so free hope again. Thou art greatly wise, my friend, and ever respected by me, yet I find not in your theory or your scope room enough for the lyric inspirations or the mysterious whispers of life. To me it seems that it is matter never to abandon oneself than often to be infatuated. Better to be wounded, a captive and a slave, than always to walk in armor. So in other words, she means, let your fancy free once in a while. See? As to magnetism, that is only a matter of fancy. You sometimes need just such a field in which to wander vagrant, and if it bear a higher name, yet it may be that, in the last result, the trance of Pythagoras might be classed with the more infantine transports of the seeress of Prevorst. So she's saying that it's all fancy, that Pythagoras is a more sophisticated version of the infantine transports of the seeress of Prevorst. So she sees this subject of the doctor's investigations as an infant. See? So you get some idea of the arrogance that's behind Margaret Fuller's great expressions of spirituality. Now let's continue. This is page 152 to 154. I mean, there's passages in here that sound as though she's, sincerely spiritual, but she isn't. It's difficult to tell what she's quoting and what she's saying for herself. This is someone named Eschenmeyer, who I believe she's quoting in a book called Mysteries. And apparently Eschenmeyer is rather of her own opinion. So he says, I say poetic creation, for to my mind, the ghosts she saw were projections of herself into objective reality. So you get the idea. She's really a skeptic, but she apparently has to take the part of someone who's not skeptical. I'm sorry, I'm struggling with my Kindle here. So now we can go to original sources. We're going to go to the Portland transcript of September 23, 1855, and we're going to see what Matthew was doing. You've seen Margaret Fuller. You understand, I think, what her real attitude toward these things was. Now we're going to show, by contrast, what Matthew's was. This is the 1855 Portland transcript, a volume in beautiful condition, I might add. And this is entitled, under the heading of Communications, I'm going to bring my light down so I can see what I'm doing, Spiritual Music, Testimony of Witnesses. And it opens by the editor. We publish below by request the testimony of several well-known citizens in regard to the reality of the musical manifestations of the spirits, an account of which we gave last week. So apparently the editor published something that was skeptical. I haven't looked at it. And here the committee comes forward with their own description of it, their own account of it. So this is a personal account of several seances in which physical mediumship was displayed. See, and underneath it they have signed. Now I'm going to read a passage. I've done this before, but I'm going to read a passage. These are the things that they witnessed, that they signed to, and Matthew's included in this. That a bass drum, snare drum, melodeon, tambourine, triangle, double bass viol, accordion, and guitar were played upon loudly and distinctly, while the hands of the medium were held by one of the committee. That several of the instruments were taken up and carried over our heads, when they had been so arranged as to make it absolutely impossible for any person present to move them without detection. That the medium was taken up in her chair and placed upon the table without, as the committee fully believed, the intervention of mortal hands. In parentheses, that spirit lights were exhibited on the wall and in several places in the absence of all other lights. That the guitar was placed upon the head of a member of the committee and in that position had familiar tunes played upon it, while the hands of the medium were on the hands of another member of the committee. That the melodeon, while placed against a wide table separating it from the medium, was inflated and played upon, the person nearest it having his hands and feet held by members of the committee. Besides these, there were numerous other manifestations of an equally marvelous character, where collusion on the part of any mediums present was, in our opinion, impossible. And although these manifestations were produced in the dark, still the arrangements were such as to render it certain, in the judgment of the committee, that they were accomplished without the aid of mortal hands, all of which we declare without hesitation or reservation. And underneath this is the signature of several members of the Spiritual Association, this committee, and M.F. Whittier is included in it. Now, we might or might not be able to think of some normal explanations. The only one I can think of is if someone dressed completely in black, black-faced and everything, tiptoes into the room and does these things in the dark, they might have not detected him or her. It's possible. In 1855, projecting lights onto the wall or through the wall without being able to see the lamp that the light came out of is pretty much of a stretch. They didn't really have the technology to make lights appear on a wall without it being light enough to where you could see what it was coming out of, I think. Could be wrong. You'd have to test that. Could you have like a pane of glass, frosted glass that was, in the wall that nobody saw, and then you shine a light through it or something, it's pretty tough. But the point I'm trying to make is that Matthew was scientifically investigating physical mediumship in 1855, which is way before the American Association for Psychical Research was established. I think it's 1884, something like that. So we're talking 30 years before the organizations that are known as the pioneers were working. Matthew Franklin Whittier was working with a handful of people doing the same thing. So this was 10 years, roughly 10, 11 years after the star sign article was written by him. But you can see his mind. This is not a wishy-washy guy who talks in terms of nervous excitement or dreams or, fanciful states or anything like that. This is a guy who, wants to prove it. And he's interested in other people who want to prove it, like Catherine Crowe, for example. So now we see Matthew Franklin Whittier's mindset, and we have seen Margaret Fuller's mindset. Having done that, let's look at this star-signed article. I'm just imagining in my mind, where are skeptics going with this? There's no question about it. I'm not, this is a real smoking gun, but you have to be open-minded, and you have to have enough discernment to be able to tell a phony from the real thing, see? If you don't have that discernment, they'll both look the same. Now, this is on the front page of the New York Weekly Tribune of the 26th. It was in the 23rd, the daily edition, which I have a microfilm copy of, but not a physical copy. I don't know if you can see it. It starts in this column. Let's see if I can get that up there. You might be able to see it. All right, so I'm going to start this. Clairvoyance. This is a review, a book review. Clairvoyance, the seerest of Prevorst, and it gives who's selling it, and there's another one, there's another couple pamphlets that he talks about. And he writes, the first of these books contains a condensation of the account given by Dr. Kerner, a learned and high-minded German, of the most remarkable case of natural somnambulism yet recorded. We say natural because, though the results are out of the common course of nature, they were not induced by the action of foreign means upon the patient. They were the development of her character, and gave the crisis to dispositions that had appeared in her family for several generations. And then he says, the translator's preface gives so good an account of the book, and in so wise and candid a spirit, that we insert it as the best we can do for our readers. This is Catherine Crowe, who is the psychical investigator, and she is concerned with proving paranormal phenomena, and she writes in that vein. So I can read some of that. I apprehend that many of the extraordinary phenomena recorded by Kerner will not find very general credence with English readers, but to the believers in clairvoyance, the book will have a deep interest, whilst to the larger class, who are not yet prepared to yield faith to its wonders, I should imagine that the facts would still be considered well worthy of attention, both in a physiological and a psychological point of view. I say italic facts because I cannot conceive the possibility of any candid mind doubting the greatest number of them after reading the book, see, her point of view, or of such an one entertaining a suspicion of imposture on the part either of physician or patient. He talks about Dr. Kerner's personal credibility and reputation and so on. So, like Matthew, Catherine Crowe was trying to prove the reality of paranormal phenomena. Not so with Margaret Fuller. So then we pick up after the preface, and Matthew continues, "We have been familiar with the book in the original," which means that Matthew had also read the original German, because Abby taught him German. See, that's how he knows it. "And could have wished that the translator, Mrs. Crowe, had screwed herself up to the wearisome task of exact translation. The book, as is so often the case with books of Germany, is diffuse and heavy, Germans rarely being gifted with the art of knowing where to stop or what to leave out." So he agrees with Fuller, at least on that point. "The abridgment is made, so far as we have examined it, with good judgment, the translator knowing how to condense instead of mutilating. Still, we miss important facts." It means that she left out some of the evidence, which he would like to have been in. But now listen to what Matthew quotes, because Margaret Fuller is not going to quote this part. I think she makes a very passing reference to levitation, but Matthew really stresses it. This is not just clairvoyance. This is levitation we're talking here. And Matthew is setting this up by way of saying that this is good research. This actually happened. This is levitation. See? So he says, speaking of the seeress, "When she was placed in a bath in this state, extraordinary phenomena were exhibited, namely that her limbs, breast, and the lower part of her person, possessed by a strange elasticity, involuntarily emerged from the water. Her attendants used every effort to submerge the body, but she could not be kept down. And had she at these times been thrown into a river, she would no more have sunk than a cork." And then he goes on to cite other examples, both among the witches, that they were tested by being thrown into water to see if they would float, and from the Catholic tradition. Now, Abby was raised Catholic. She would have been very well familiar with the saints and the history of the saints, so she would have taught him about these things. So he says, according to the testimony of St. Teresa, Peter of Alcantara for 14 years allowed himself but half an hour's sleep, and that he took sitting with his head leaning on a post. He lived on bread and water, which he took at intervals of 3 and sometimes 8 days, till by the mortification of his body it became transparent, and he saw through it as through a veil. His spirit being in constant communion with God, he was frequently enveloped in a lustrous light and lifted into the air. St. Teresa also felt her soul, and then her head, and finally her whole body lifted from the earth, and in the sight of all the sisterhood, she floated over the grate of the door. Many such instances are recorded in the lives of the saints, phenomena which we cannot comprehend and therefore pronounce to be fables. So Margaret Fuller is on the side of the fables. Matthew Franklin Whittier is not. There is no question in my mind but that Matthew was the author of that star-signed review and not Margaret Fuller. And I have plenty of evidence showing that he was the author of all but maybe a handful of the other ones. So that means that Matthew Franklin Whittier was in New York City at the time, writing as the star for the New York Tribune, which is like a block away from the Evening Mirror where Poe wrote, and that Matthew was the one who inserted that outrageous, strong clue that says that Edgar Allan Poe stole the raven from him and was a fool, which I have given in my paper and other places. Now, what we're going to do, that's for those of you who only like to watch a short video. That's 38 minutes. I'll probably cut it down to 35, something like that. That will probably satisfy most of you. But I'm going to go into this a little more and show a little more about Matthew's background in spiritualism, not anywhere near all of it, because there's a ton of it. But let's look at The Night Side of Nature. I'll put up on the screen what that book looks like. It was first published in 1848, although if you find it, you'll see penciled in, it says 1869 or something like that. That's not correct. It was 1848. So only like 3 years later. Is that right? 4 years later. Math is not my strong point, you may have noticed. So this here that I'm trying to fit on a little tiny table is the 1850 edition of the Boston Weekly Museum. That's the volume. And it's quite fragile at this point. And I am going to go to what I believe is Matthew's excerpt from The Night Side of Nature. And the reason I think it's Matthew's is, first of all, I know he was writing for this paper. And secondly, I know that he wrote reviews anonymously for the papers that he was involved in. And on the left-hand side here, we have quails. That was not Ocean Dodge, as the historians mistakenly believe. That was Matthew Franklin Whittier. I can prove that. And we have a letter from him on the left-hand side. It's page 198. On page 199 at the top, we have a poem about Uncle Joe. Matthew, that was one of Matthew's pseudonyms, Joe, in this newspaper. So that's by style and the fact that it's about Joe, I'm saying that that was Matthew Franklin Whittier's poem. Immediately under that is one that's absolutely Matthew's. It's called Stray Leaves from the Unpublished Biography of Botheration Bartlett. It's signed by Ethan Spike, Esquire, late of Hornby, Maine. Well, that's Matthew's one historically known character, only this is a sketch. It's not about Ethan Spike at all. It's a sketch about a character named Botheration Bartlett. Long story about that. Immediately right next door to Botheration Bartlett is something called Troubled Spirits. And this is the one that he quotes from The Night Side of Nature. And that's where I got that. I looked up that name and found Catherine Crowe's book, The Night Side of Nature. So toward the bottom here, he says, I have heard of 3 instances of persons now alive who declare that they hold continued intercourse with their deceased partners. This is a quote from The Night Side of Nature. It says, one of these is a naval officer whom the author of a book lately called the, quote, unseen world appears to be acquainted with. The second is a professor in a college in America, a man of eminence and learning and full of activity and energy. Yet he assured a friend of mine that he receives constant visits from his departed wife, which afford him great satisfaction. The third example is a lady in this country, meaning England. She is united to a second husband, has been extremely happy in both marriages, and declares that she receives frequent visits from her first. Then he says, Oberlin, the good pastor of Bon de la Roche, asserted the same thing of himself. His wife came to him frequently after her death, was seen by the rest of his household as well as himself, and warned him beforehand of many events that occurred, and it's attributed to Night Side of Nature. That's Catherine Crowe, and that is what Matthew chose to excerpt from her next book. And that is the person that he was reviewing as a translator in the New York Tribune. So again, this is not the kind of dreamy, maybe I believe it, maybe I don't, Margaret Fuller. In 1857, middle of 1857, there was a minister in Portland, Maine, named Reverend Dwight. And elsewhere, I have a description of Reverend Dwight, and it says that he was a fundamentalist, that he was into the Old Testament, that he believed in hanging, that kind of guy. And he took up the sword against the spiritualists, and he gave a sermon in which he said that God doesn't want us to know these things and so forth and so on, and that it can all be explained by magnetism, that no angel would have anything to do with it, and so forth and so on. And Matthew, anonymously as a reporter, reported on that talk. And then, that was May 2nd. Then on May 30, there is Spiritualism, a reply of Mr. Woodman, that's the president of the association, to Dr. Dwight. And Matthew reported on that as well. Then The lecture or series of lectures were put into pamphlet or booklet form. This is called a reply to William T. Dwight, D.D. on Spiritualism by Jabez C. Woodman. And there it is. I'll put it up on the screen as well. And this was published in 1857. And as is customary with these things, in the opening, there is reprinted a letter. This says Portland, July 1857, asking the person that gave the talk to publish it in book form. And it says, we, the undersigned, members of the government of the Portland Association of Spiritualists, respectfully request you to furnish for the press a copy of your reply to Reverend Dr. Dwight's sermon against spiritualism. That means that these people signing were the officers of the club. Matthew's name is in here, signing as members of the government of the association. In other words, signing as an officer of the club. And I'll put that up on the screen. This is a very erudite, well-written book. And in the review, Matthew says that the lecture was very poorly organized, Mr. Woodman's lecture. But this is extremely well organized. So I'm telling you what I'm certain of by style is that Matthew Ghost wrote it. So this is actually Matthew's writing. And it's very hard-hitting. It's very logical. There's a lot of examples drawn from many sources. It mostly is biblical, which of course it should be since it's refuting Dr. Dwight. It's very well written. I don't know this, but I suspect this is considered a classic in spiritualist literature. And it really was written by Matthew Franklin Whittier. So it's another one that's the authorship has been lost. So there's that whole business. There's also the fact that Matthew Franklin Whittier was a signer on, I think it was 15,000 signatures. A petition was sent to Congress in 1854, and I think there was 15,000 signatures on it, if I remember correctly. You can find this online. Unfortunately, you can't find a picture of the actual document. I'd love to do that, but apparently, like the one guy managed to get hold of it, and write down all the names, but it's not easy to get to. But I'll show you what it looks like on the website. You can see M.F. Whittier. If you get on that website and look for the list of signers and you search M space F space Whittier with no periods, you will go right to it. So Matthew was a signer on that petition to Congress to urge them to seriously investigate spiritualism and spiritualist phenomena. So then there's one other indication of how serious Matthew was about this topic, and that is a letter that he wrote to his brother about it. And I'll go ahead and read a portion of that letter. So I should have on my Kindle here. This is written from Portland on February 19, 1857, and I won't talk about any of the personal stuff, but he says, spiritualism continues on the increase in this city. There are 2 meetings every Sunday, one at Pianoforte Hall on Federal Street, and the other at the rooms of the Mechanics Institute. At the latter, the attendance will average about 400. The officiating clergymen at this house are J.G. Woodman, the president of York Cumberland Railway. That's the president of the association. Then S.B. Beckett, who's one of the correspondents of the Advertiser. Somebody else's name I can't make out. And myself. Says, I have preached 4, quote, sermons this winter. Once from the text, quote, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than your philosophy has dreamed of. And at another time, my text was, quote, what good will it do? Will it pay? So far as I can judge, my efforts in this line have not been remarkably edifying, having rather an amusing tendency. Remember, he was a humorist. One of my parishioners told me the other day, quote, he liked to hear me preach. It was so funny. Encouraging, wasn't it? It's being sarcastic, of course. Another says my sermons are as good as Dow Jr.'s patent ones, which is really a left-handed compliment. Thus, my parochial labors are encouraged. Of course, they are much lighter for it. So Matthew preached at least 4 spiritualist sermons, So that's how serious he was about this topic. And you can go in and study Margaret Fuller all you want. If you read between the lines and you're really honest with the thing, you will see that she was pretending to be a lot more of a believer than she really was, and that she couldn't possibly have written that star-signed article about Catherine Crowe's translation of the Seeress of Provorst. I think that's all that I really have to share on that. It's a smoking gun, but you have to be able to discern between real spirituality and somebody who's just pretending. See? And that's true with all of these. It's true with Edgar Allan Poe and The Raven. Edgar Allan Poe, once you get to know him, he could not possibly have written The Raven if you understand what The Raven really is. If you take it as a gothic horror poem written in imagination, then yeah, Poe could have written it, but it was not. It was a poem written in terrible grief by a believer, an esoteric Christian, who was going through a horrible faith crisis. And it's about his faith crisis. Poe could not possibly have written it. And then if you look at the way that he says he wrote it in the Philosophy of Composition, that clinches it, because he couldn't possibly have written The Raven the way that he describes in the Philosophy of Composition. And he was not joking. You know, that's the way he wrote poetry, in my opinion. So these things are obvious. That's the problem I'm up against. I'm presenting things that are obvious, but you have to be objective, and you have to be open-minded, and you have to be discerning. So, you know, I think 25 people actually have looked at my previous entry where I explain at some length exactly how Edgar Allan Poe falsely claimed The Raven from Matthew Franklin Whittier in the whole world. And how many people are in academia? How many people are in literature, literary history? And only 25 people, you know, can watch some portion of that. So it's a very strange circumstance. I don't really know what to say, except that I've got the goods, and it's a matter of time before people come around and realize that I'm not imagining, I'm not joking, I'm not being fondly deluded about something that's going to put a big feather in my cap and make me famous, you know, because I have a big ego. It's none of that. You know, this is the findings that I had. If I hadn't found these things, I wouldn't report them. But since I did find them, I think I have the right to report them. You know, it's basically what it amounts to. So there we have it. And I hope you might find this interesting. And if nothing else, the next thing I'm going to do is to go through A Christmas Carol and explain without notes on that one just exactly how Dickens ended up with the supposed authorship of that work.